Hey everyone, so this video is another teaching overview of week 4 of our Holy Habits series, which is week 4 of Church at Home. So we've gone through 3 habits already. We've gone through the habit of personal devotion, looking at things like reading the Bible and praying and doing that regularly and habitually. We've gone through looking at the habit of remembering, which is the habit of practicing things like the sacraments, the habit of practicing things like worship and testimonies. And then last week we looked at the habit of gathering, which is the habit of being together, which we saw that the church over 2,000 years has been in this regular cyclical habit of making sure that it gathers. And this week we're looking at the habit of generosity, which is the habit of giving oneself, giving out of one's self without the expectation of return. And the habit of generosity is often thought of with regards to finances, so giving of one's resources, money, etc., and things like offerings and tithes, etc., or even just paying for someone's meal. We often think of generosity in those senses, but the habit of generosity is also developing the habit of being generous with one's time, with one's energy, with one's love, with one's knowledge and wisdom, which can be seen even in people who are in professions, helping and mentoring others without the expectation of return. So let's take a quick look at this, give an overview of this, so that we'll be ready to tackle this on Sunday. So what is generosity? Generosity is already what I've said. It is this act of giving of oneself without the expectation of return. So it is the act of giving of one's resources, of one's time, of one's energy, of one's knowledge, of one's love, without the expectation that it will be reciprocated. So it's the ability to pay for someone's meal because you love them, not because you hope that they will pay for your meal the next time, or the act of giving of one's knowledge, not because you want something from them. That is to be generous. It's this giving out of oneself to someone else for their benefit in one sense, and not for your own return. So generous person in that sense is not like a petty person. They're not the person counting the cents at the dinner table, hoping everyone is paid their dues. A generous person is one who just is able to give out of themselves. And a generous person is one who doesn't need someone to reciprocate. I remember once having a conversation with someone who was particularly hurt because they had invited someone over for dinner, and that person hadn't invited them back. And we had to have a conversation around what does generosity mean, and were they inviting someone over because they wanted to be generous, or because they actually just wanted an invite themselves. And generosity, and it's not bad to say that sometimes inviting someone in the hope that they would reciprocate is a bad thing. It's just to say that generosity and the habit that we want to practice now is not that habit. It is the habit of being able to give without the expectation of that being reciprocated. Now, generosity is seen all over the church, and it talks about being generous on all occasions, or we hear about the church being generous in Acts 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We hear about the church and people giving and being generous and giving of themselves, so much so that it says that there was no one who had need. Jesus tells the story with his disciples of watching the widow give her very last coin, and that story now goes into history, being told all over the world for the last 2,000 years, because Jesus recognizes this incredible act of generosity. Jesus himself is the model of generosity, for he gives not just of his resources, he gives of his very own life for others. And we want to be a people who are generous, who is generous. Now, generosity is not just about excess, as Jesus' story with the widow tells us. It's not just about giving out of our abundance, out of the excess that we have that we no longer need. Generosity is about giving of one's self. And sometimes that means giving of even of your own needs. And so that means generosity is for every person. This is not just a message or a habit for the rich. It's a habit for every Christian to learn how to be generous in their own circumstances. And that means generosity requires not the abundance of resources, but an attitude of one's heart. That from the inside comes an overflow out. Jesus tells that story in John 17, that he will give us living waters that will flow from within us and flows out. And when I think of that, I think like God's love and the work of His Spirit does something internally that results in us being the kind of people that can give and be generous and kind and cause an overflow to go to others. And so being generous is not about the resources we have as much as it is about the abundance of love and kindness and the work of God inside of us. It is, in one sense, it's also about being content, in James, Peter talks about, contentment is of great gain. And contentment is being satisfied with whatever circumstance you are in. I think of that Philippians story. He says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. But he has learned the gift of being content in all circumstances. And when we learn to be content, we also learn to be generous. So we want to develop the habit of generosity, and the habit means building generosity into our rhythms. It means building generosity into the things that we repeatedly do. We don't just want to be generous on one occasion. We want to learn to be generous habitually over and over again. Which means that there are some things we can do to help develop or things that just show us what a habitual thing of generosity looks like. For example, like giving monthly, regularly, cyclically, repeatedly to the church is one of the ways that we are generous, or making a set evening in our week where we invite people over into our home just so that we can bless them with a meal and with our time. Sometimes having the habit of generosity is setting aside time every week just to serve, whether it's to serve church or others or an NPO. It's about setting time aside so that we can be generous. Sometimes it's setting resources. Sometimes it's setting, is putting into our schedule certain things. Sometimes developing the habit of being generous is setting aside time or energy or resources to mentor someone else. It's basically putting into our schedule, our monthly budgets, our weekly time rhythms, our daily rhythms, time and resources and opportunity to give without the need for someone to return. And one of the things that we can do that really helps us to be generous is to make sure that we live with a certain margin in our own lives. Margin is like, space on the outside. If you think of a margin on a page, it's that space on the left-hand side of the page, and you only start writing after the margin, etc. And it creates white space. And margin is the space in our lives so that we don't live to our complete limits. It's creating space around the outside of our lives, around the outside of our finances, around the outside of our times, so that we're not just living to our complete limits. It's having space and a gap in which we can give up our time, our resources, our wisdom, etc., etc. And sometimes when it comes to generosity, it requires to give even out of our need. But if we want to learn the cyclical habit of being generous, one of the things we do is learn to live with margin in our lives. But sometimes we can't just be generous in a very planned way. Sometimes being a generous person requires us to respond to the spontaneous calls for generosity. Maybe a friend phones you up because their tire's punctured and they need your help. And sometimes being generous is stopping what you're doing to give of your time to go and help. Or it's that random request from someone who needs some of your resources. Being generous is putting it into our habits, but also allowing those spontaneous calls. But just a few tips that can help us to be generous is develop margin in your life, as I've said, which is setting aside time, setting aside resources, putting into your schedule, etc., setting aside and making sure that you live with space in your life to be generous. The other thing is to give at the start rather at the end. If you're hoping to give and be a generous person, if you think that's going to come right at the end, after you've paid for everything, spent everything, you often find yourself not being generous. You've just run through your time or your energy, or you've just run through all your finances and you find you don't have anything left. So being a generous person is prioritizing it, which means setting it in your budget, setting it in your plan, setting it in your schedule up front, so that you develop the habit and the routine around generosity. It requires us being disciplined to be generous. Generosity, or another tip, is to be prepared to be inconvenienced. I think of Jesus spending time alone. It says he goes up to the mountainside to spend time alone to pray. He needs a gap. He needs some alone time. But then people come and find him, and he allows himself to be inconvenienced. And I think that part of being generous is to allow in our lives certain inconveniences, which allows us to love people. And I think the most important tip about being generous is learning to be loved by God. Our contentment comes from God's love. Once we know that we are loved in God, and that God's goodness is upon us, and that he is working out all things for the good of those who love him, once we are secure in God's love, it's like then from the inside out comes generosity. From this contentment and overflow of God's love becomes this willingness to give of our time, resources, energy, to give of our wisdom and love. This river flows out of the spring that God has set inside of us. Being a generous person often means being a content person. And being a content person means allowing ourselves to live under the favor and love and kindness and gaze of our God in heaven. Anyway, we as a church, what we want to be is we want to be generous people. We're not necessarily saying we want to be the wealthiest people. We're not necessarily saying that we want to be the people who have an abundance of resources to give away. What we are saying, though, is we want to be the kind of people who regularly and habitually shape and live our lives in such a way that we have stuff to give. Time, energy, wisdom, resources, love to others without the expectation of return. We want every single one of us to be generous people. God bless Harbour City. Hope you have a good day.